Let me head straight to my guests now who are joining us here on the show, starting with Teresa Fallon, Director of the Center for Russia-Europe-Asia Studies and Senior Fellow at Chicago Council. Also being joined by Vladislav Bartofiuski, Member of Parliament from Poland, and Svetslav Yurash, Ukrainian Member of Parliament. But he also spoke about how there are double standards, and I want to come to you for that. He said, why is Ukraine war being discussed in G20, which is a platform to discuss economic issues and macroeconomics, financial issues of the world? He drew parallels with Yugoslavia, Afghanistan, and all those issues never coming up in G20, and indicating that this strategy, he says, is going to fail, that is being brought in. You think it's going to lead to a very tough time for host country India now to get some consensus going because of this?
I think Mr. Lavrov is not is economical with the truth, because the war in Yugoslavia was, strictly speaking, a civil war before the various nations in the former Yugoslavia, which fell apart. And Afghanistan was a different issue. It was seen as a war on terror, which actually India also supported at the time. So here we have a first war on the continental Europe, massive scale war since the Second World War in 1945, and that's a big difference. It's a war of aggression, and Mr. Putin forgets one thing. He says Ukrainians are not a people, Ukraine is not a sovereign state, they have no right to independence. But in 1991 it was the Russian Federation president who said Ukraine is an independent state, and so is Russia, and so is Belarus. And it was acknowledged by all successive presidents of the Russian Federation and by the United Nations. It's in violation of all treaties existing since 1945 that if a foreign force comes and invades a foreign state, acknowledged by everybody. After all, there was a Ukrainian embassy in Moscow, and then commits crimes against humanity, which is acknowledged by the UN, crimes of aggression, does brutal slaughter of women and children. Imagine what would the Indian public said if an Indian army, a pride of the country, went to rape women and kill children who are civilians. It would be an outrage in this country, and rightly so. I could not imagine the Indian army doing any such thing, or even contemplating doing such thing. And it was done and well documented. And let's not forget that Russia occupied Ukraine in the 18th century and colonized it. And it's true, Ukraine was under Russia as a colony until 1991. And they don't want to be a colony, like many other states do not want to be colonies.
Sir, G20's mandate is finances, economy. On that count, I think Lavrov was not incorrect completely. If I play the devil's advocate and put to you what Russia is saying, and their objection at the finance ministers' meeting in Bengaluru was that the entire onus of the jitters in the global economy, that entire onus is being put on Russia and the war in Ukraine. They believe that there are other reasons, that the world was coming out of COVID, and there are several other reasons. Why connect only the Ukraine war with the jitters in the global economy?
Yeah, because after the pandemic, the biggest economic problem started with the Russian invasion in Ukraine. The price of energy everywhere, everybody is suffering. The inability of Ukrainians to sell millions of tons of grain to sub-Saharan Africa and to North Africa, which will cause famine in these parts of the world. And it's not because Ukrainians don't want to, it's because the Russians block it. It's maximum one or two ships leave the ports, despite the agreements that there should be many more. So that is, imagine the situation of India 50 years ago, where India was short of grain. What kind of damage would that cause? India is now a flourishing nation. It's one of the G20. It's a major economic and power, and has global responsibilities, and fulfills these responsibilities, because India never says we don't want the rule of law, we don't obey international order. No, we are an example how it could be done. and Putin says, I don't care, I'm going to invade, I'm going to occupy, and if anybody suffers, it's not my problem. I get the money for selling gas and oil. Now this is going to come to an end. But for the time being, he benefits from it, and he finances his war from selling a couple of resources. And so, but India is not on that side. India is on the side of the peace-loving people, and was for very many decades. And India sees that as a global threat, because India is a global player.
Teresa Fallon, coming first to you. What would you say to what the Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov said today with regards to the NATO expansion eastwards being a breaking of commitment by the West, and therefore he said this war was on us, not the other way around?
Well, I don't think that was any surprise. That's a Russian speaking point, but we know that the tensions really began with the accession agreement when Ukrainians wanted to sign the accession agreement with the EU, and that's when they went out on the Maidan and started to protest. So Putin understood that he might be losing Ukraine towards the West, and that's probably when the tensions really started to expand. And let's face it, there have been frozen conflicts. He's done the same thing in Georgia, Moldova, he's trying to upset things there, and there's also frozen conflicts in Transnistria. So we see his strategy, and Lavrov is a brilliant propagandist, and he kept at it, and even his Indian interlocutor, he just put him off balance. He wouldn't answer any of his questions, and he gave his well-practiced spiel. So there have been books written about this. There's a new book out called Not a Single Inch, Not 1 Inch, and that clarified all of the agreements, all the documents. So Lavrov is a brilliant manipulator, and I think that we have to keep in mind that this was a war that Russia started on Ukraine, and now it's a terrible miscalculation on the part of Putin. It's taken far longer than he ever imagined.
Yurash, what Lavrov also said was that Ukraine does not want to negotiate, and that US also doesn't intend that Ukraine negotiates at this juncture till they have won the war on the ground. He says that a decree was passed last year by the Ukrainians that till Putin is at the helm of affairs, there will be no negotiation.
Mr. Lavrov lies and will lie some more. I'm very saddened that he's invited to speak at this esteemed forum, because the one thing that the world will be served by his speeches is another bunch of lies. And I believe firmly that India is one of the nations that will decide the fate of the 21st century, should deserve the truth. And to me, Mr. Lavrov and his interpretation of reality is not something that should be discussed, because every single treaty that Russia signed, they've broken. And the reality is what's happening now between China and Russia will prove the Indian relationship with Russia also under question, under strain. So my point here is very simple. Russia is engaged in this war of imperial aggression that should not be something that the countries that suffered most from imperial aggression in the past should tolerate.
But is any sort of negotiation possible, or are lines now being drawn and positions that are being taken are very, very strong?
We negotiated with them since 2014. For 8 years, our negotiators were in Minsk negotiating a way out of their invasion of part of Ukraine. The sad story is that the only result of that was full-scale Russian invasion. But now to suggest that negotiations, the next step is to suggest that if Britain reinvaded India and you fought a war for a year, and then they say, we keep Western Bengal. You know, you take the rest in peace and we keep West Bengal. I think Indians wouldn't agree, because they should decide the fate of their country. We also don't agree, and we think when we have our nation, we will decide our country's future, because Ukrainians should decide what Ukraine should be.
One final question to you before I move to my other segment with regards to Quad. Where do you see this war headed now? Are we looking at a resolution? Do you see the world wanting to push for a resolution? And what role do you see India playing?
The world demands a resolution. The world demands for Russia to agree to the simple fact that other nations can't invade other nations at a whim. And we live in an age where nations decide the fate of their country, not the invader, not the imperial power, and not any other mad historical concept the dictators have in their minds. The point here is that as soon as Russia leaves, peace will return. And that's the goal that we have, that Russia leaves our country alone to decide our own future by our nation.
What role do you see India playing?
I see India as a crucial force to try and reinforce to Mr. Putin the basic fact that Mr. Modi said best. This is not the age for imperial conquest, not the age of war.
One of the outcomes we agreed on was that the listings of terrorists, the counter-terrorism side listings should not be politicized. These were some of the outcomes. So, I mean, there were a lot of things which I can't tell you. But this is the public side of what we can tell you. So I thought collectively I should be putting it out.
Let me go back to my guest, Theresa Fallon, who continues to be with us. Theresa, the Quad always mentions that this grouping is not against a particular country. But China obviously sees it differently, and perhaps the unstated but understandable focus of the Quad is to at least provide a counter to China's growing assertiveness, aggressiveness in the Indo-Pacific. How would you say the Quad has come about to be able to do that?
Well, at today's Raisina conference, they put together an incredible panel of foreign ministers involved with the Quad. And the one part that was missing was, it's almost like Voldemort. They don't mention China and they don't mention security. So they were emphasizing cooperation, variable geometry, and they even kind of were playing off each other, talking about that they're the four Beatles and that there could be a fifth Beatle. So other countries could join. It was all about cooperation, regional groupings, and so vaccine diplomacy, security of supply chains. So all of it was like a very positive narrative. And I think that they're trying to build habits of cooperation. And I think it's not just, India is also concerned about flagging anything. No one wants to upset China, neither does Japan, but I think that this is coming together. The Quad is almost a tentative type of Quad, but I think that these habits of cooperation will help strengthen it. But I think nobody will announce, and we see the same thing with AUKUS, the Australia, UK, US type of sub-regional grouping, which also has nuclear submarines. So I think that we're seeing more and more activity in the Indo-Pacific because China's actions are being responded to, even with an increase of doubling the defense spending in Japan. So in many respects, China has almost created this situation by their belligerent activity in the South China Sea and the East China Sea, and also in India.
In fact, I was going to ask you about whether AUKUS overshadows Quad now, and will it be more effective than the Quad because it's clearly a security alliance?
I think that both are very, very important. I think India is key. The Quad is a very, very important grouping, but I think there's hesitation by some members as they don't want to portray it as a security grouping, nor do they want to seem like they're grouping together in order to balance China, which is pretty much what is happening. But I think that this caution is warranted, and as long as it can continue to cooperate and have this positive feedback, these habits of cooperation will lead to better things and more trust between all players.
Theresa Fallon, many thanks for speaking with us. And since you mentioned the Beatles and the reference to Beatles that was given by the Japanese foreign minister, we'll try and play out that soundbite, that exact bite of what he said. And as Theresa Fallon mentioned, that it showed that the Quad is flexible and is open to others as well. Listen in.
This is a kind of, not a band like the Beatles. The member is fixed and they always play together in 10 years. But this is more like a more kind of soft group, so that even within the Beatles, Paul McCartney can release the album by solo.
The Quad foreign ministers came out with a joint statement. In fact, some of the important highlights of the joint statement suggest that the Quad working group on counter-terrorism is now going to be established, which will meet very soon in the United States. That's where the first meeting of the Quad counter-terrorism working group will be held. Apart from that, the countries also emphasized on continuing to discuss the issue of Ukraine as well. These were some of the highlights of the Quad meeting for which the Japanese foreign minister traveled to India. This after he in fact was not able to attend the G20 foreign ministers meeting. That's it for the moment. Many thanks for joining us. Bye-bye.